All right, so a couple housekeeping things before we get going. We'll kind of set up what the rest of this week looks like. I mentioned some changes that are occurring to the course. Um, where is it at? Fourth Canvas discussion is due by the end of the day tomorrow. So make sure if you haven't done that already, you're getting on and getting that completed because what I posted today is the fifth and final Canvas discussion, which is going to be related to what we talked about with both fiscal and monetary policy, primarily focusing on some of the secondary effects that existed with both of those. Very similar to the other two. I've got kind of a set of initial prompts, questions. You need to answer all of those to kind of earn the 10 points, and then you'll respond to, it looks like I need to change these. They defaulted to numbers. This should be A and B. And so then you're going to respond to one student's um, response for 2A, and then another student's response to 3A and 3B. So each of those worth 5 points. So kind of very similar to the last ones. I've got this set to be due by the end of the day on Thursday. So make sure you're getting those out of the way so you can start studying for the final exam. Okay, so in fact, we'll kind of get rid of this. I'll put up a final exam category um, after class today. So some other due dates before we talk about that. The Module 12 reading was due before we started class today. These module quizzes always due 2 days after they're assigned, so that July 24th one due by the beginning of class tomorrow. We'll have an in-class quiz today and tomorrow, both those due 2 days after, so Wednesday and Thursday morning before we start class. Tomorrow's daily quiz will be the last one. Okay, so after these due dates pass, I'll kind of update those daily quiz grades. I'll drop your two lowest. Because that module reading has passed, I'm actually going to adjust Canvas so that it drops your lowest module reading because we're actually not going to do module 13. I think this will benefit all of you because it was kind of a disjointed, separate topic. And so it allows us to kind of focus more on topics that are all closely related to each other. So the final exam is going to be everything we've covered since the last exam. It's not cumulative. I've tried to reiterate this. It's just going to be modules 9, 10, 11, and 12. So tomorrow's class, we'll get a little bit more work on how we incorporate all those concepts into kind of one question, not just specifically one, but like, if we ask you different questions that kind of connect monetary and fiscal policy, connect monetary policy to what we're going to be talking about in the international markets, et cetera. So it kind of keeps our topics a little bit less of a um, range of topics. So I think that'll benefit you also. One less module reading, some fewer questions on the quiz. So I'll also, after tomorrow's class, post the sixth and final quiz. That'll be due by the end of the day, Thursday as well. It will only be over module 12. So I've got a set of practice problems I'll get up later today. And it's going to cover about 12 questions from module 12, and the quiz will be a little bit shorter than the other quizzes. Same amount of time, but it's just going to focus on module 12. And then some of what we do tomorrow, kind of connecting module 12, like the last three questions, connecting module 12 to some of the stuff we talked about in modules 9, 10, and 11. Okay. So in terms of the final, it's on Friday. I think the syllabus originally had some different times. I extended it kind of like similar to the second exam. It'll be 9:30 to 3:30 this Friday. You can get on at any point in time. Now, you'll need to start it before 1:30 if you want the full time. So on this one, you'll have a full 2 hour time block. Okay. Um, Actually, I think what I'll do, I'll extend that just because we do meet at 2 o'clock and to make sure it meets with people's schedules. I'll actually open that up to 4. I wasn't thinking about that until I just said it. But for this section, to make sure um, you're able to start it at the same time we would usually have class, it'll be open from 9:30 to 4 that day. And once you start, you'll have 2 hours to complete it. We're going to use that honor lock program. And so it'll look very similar to the second exam. So you'll see pop up on Canvas after class today. I'm going to post a extra credit kind of test of the honor lock system once again. So whatever device you're going to use, whatever webcam, there's make sure that's working. We're going to kind of do a test of that honor lock system. It'll have 3 questions. As long as you respond to any of them or to all of them, you'll earn 3 extra credit points. So if you were to get an 84% on the final, that would be boosted to an 87. So that should be pretty easy points. You're just getting on. It has questions about, when the exam is, the materials you can have. Um, there's no right or wrong. Well, there are right answers, but you're going to be scored just for simply submitting an answer, submitting that quiz. Now, because I have to have a correct answer set, initially it'll look like maybe if you got it wrong or you went with a different option, it will look like you don't get the full points. I'm going to have that extra credit quiz due by the time we start class on Thursday. So on Thursday, I can get on and kind of get it updated to as long as you submitted something, I'll kind of have it scored so you're getting the full points. It's just in the meantime, it might look like you didn't, but as long as you respond to that quiz, as long as you make sure you're testing the equipment you're going to be using for the actual exam on Friday, you'll get those 3 extra credit points added to your final score or final exam score. And I'll post that up under another heading that says like final exam materials. So that's kind of where you'll see at the very bottom of the homepage there. I'm trying to get this chat open. I can see it. There we go. If you're releasing an extra. Yeah, so we're just, if you're thinking about studying for the final, you're going to have practice problems for that kind of fourth and fifth quiz, right? As well as kind of the practice problems I'll be posting for that sixth quiz. And then you can review the old quizzes and then you can review once you submit the sixth quiz, I'll have it set so you can see your answers and what you got right or wrong. You won't be able to see necessarily the correct answer, right? But you can rework those ones that you got wrong. And if you have any questions on those, you can kind of reach out to me. And if you do have questions, what we'll be doing is primarily a review session Wednesday and Thursday. Wednesday, I probably will have a set of questions I bring in that will be kind of the more complicated ones in the final that I'll want to work through to start out with. But really, any questions you have Wednesday or Thursday, we can work through similar problems or that actual problems themselves from any of those materials. Um, and so that final is really going to be a combination of things you would see on any of those practice problem sets and any of those quizzes. Any questions on that? Um, Let me think if there's anything else I want to say here. And I said that fourth quiz. I apologize. That was prior to the exam. So really, you're just focusing on kind of quiz 5 and then quiz 6 here. Okay. Any other questions before we kind of dive into things? And I'll post an announcement that has these things mentioned. I've updated the syllabus to kind of include this information now, but I do think it'll be beneficial to you guys that we're not doing module 13. Just there would be more material you have to go through. I think this will make it a little bit easier. Okay. Any other questions for me before we get started here? Oh, and I don't know if I mentioned this, but because we have all the module readings in now, I'll actually update Canvas after class so that it kind of drops your lowest score there, and you'll only be scored out of 10 instead of 11. I think originally it was going to have 12, 11 instead of 12. Here, still dropping the lowest, and we just have one for your module reading. It'll be scaled up to the same number of points that it states in the syllabus, though. Okay. All right. So make sure I get this pulled up. There we go. So what we're going to be talking about the next 2 days is the international market, specifically related to currency, and thinking about exchange rates. So if we're thinking about markets, we've got a domestic market and a foreign market, right? So we're going to think about there's a market for a country's currency, right? So if we look at the data, I mean, there's a ton of currency that's traded every single day. If we look at the overall holding of from foreign economies of different currencies, you can see that like the majority of foreign currency held is the US dollar. And then as we look at kind of weaker and weaker currencies, there's less and less of it held by other countries. But you can see there's a lot of currency that's being held by different banks across the world. And so we're going to kind of think about why is the US dollar held more than others, and kind of dive into these foreign domestic exchange markets. Okay. So just like any other market, we're going to have a supply and demand curve for currency. So I'll first start setting this example up, and we'll think about foreign currency. Once we get about 15 minutes into class, we're only going to be thinking out the market for US currency just to make it a little bit easier. We're not going to be bouncing back and forth. But for now, think about there's going to be a certain amount of quantity that we demand of a foreign currency. Now, how much of that is going to be related to its price? So the price of foreign kind of the US dollar per foreign currency. So how much currency does it take to buy one US dollar? What is the price of a US dollar in terms of that foreign currency? So if we're thinking about the quantity demanded for a foreign country, if the price of the US dollar goes down, right, then they're going to want to hold more of that currency, right? All other things kind of being equal. Okay. So if the US dollar is cheaper, they're going to want to hold more of it, right? So the demand is kind of decreasing just like we would see for any other market. We can kind of think about why that relationship exists, and we'll work through some numerical examples on a table and an equation to kind of support this. But let's assume that we have a laptop, and in the United States, it costs $1,000. So that's the price in the US dollar, in terms of the US dollar. If the exchange rate improves for another country, so this is the idea that every dollar, if it costs 10 units of the foreign currency, so maybe this is like 10 pesos, 10 yen, well, then the price in terms of the foreign currency, well, if I'm buying that $1,000 laptop, if I need 1,000 US dollars, but every single dollar is worth 10 of my currency, the total amount of my currency I would need, or the price in terms of my currency would be 1,000 times however many units of my currency equals $1, one US dollar. So all we would be doing to determine the price is the price in the foreign currency is the price in the US times what we'll end up kind of calling that exchange rate, right? So if we kind of just go through and do that math here, we get the different prices. Well, if the price is higher for these foreign markets of these goods, they're going to demand less. And then as that price falls, or as that exchange rate we can think about for right now is just getting better, I'm going to want to buy more of those products from the US, right? The price is falling to me because that exchange rate is changing. And as a result, as the price goes down, I'm going to want to buy more products from the US or from the other country. It doesn't have to just be the US. I just kind of will use them primarily as the examples here. So if we think about this demand schedule, right, or this table that kind of shows us the price and the quantity of from this foreign country, as that exchange rate improves, we said requires less foreign currency, which would increase our total demand. We can kind of think about, well, what's the total number of dollars I would require to buy, or that I would want to buy this number of goods? Well, it's going to be whatever the price is in terms of my foreign currency, divided by the exchange rate times the quantity of that good. That's the number of required US dollars I'm going to need in order to buy this many, this much of the whatever good I'm looking at, right? The number of units of that good that I'm demanding. So you can kind of think about it here as if I have the quantity of that good multiplied by whatever the price is in terms of that foreign currency divided by the exchange rate, then I kind of end up with that quantity of the number of US dollars I would need to buy that amount of goods. So here, kind of working backwards, you would take the price in the foreign currency divided by the exchange rate. That's the price of the number of US dollars for every unit. Multiply that by the number of units I would have, and that's my total quantity. So if we go back to our earlier example, really every unit, if a laptop was $1,000, I would need $1,000 for each one. So 1,000 times 200 gives me that 200,000, et cetera, et cetera. So because that price in the foreign currency is changing as the exchange rate changes, the amount of the US dollar that I demand will actually be going up, right, as the price in my foreign currency goes down. So we'll kind of think about this relationship in a slightly different way. And these are kind of primarily going to be the types of questions you see when we're talking about foreign currency. After this, we'll kind of transition just to be thinking about the market for US currency. So if we have an equation, right, the quantity demanded of a specific product from a foreign country, it looks just like any other demand equation we have. We have some constant, we have a negative slope, which reflects that as the price goes up for this good, we're going to demand less. And that's our typical demand curve. Now, what is the price in terms of the foreign good? Well, we said it was the price of the, in terms of the, sorry, US dollar times whatever that exchange rate was. That's how we were building out kind of this column here. So if I take that and just kind of substitute it into our demand equation, we'll see that the demand from a foreign country for our product is the intercept minus the slope times, this was like the price of that good in terms of the foreign currency. So if we kind of take this one step further, well, the quantity of US dollars we need, we said would be kind of whatever that price was in terms of the US, like $1,000 for a laptop times whatever we demand, however many units we want to buy. So another way we could kind of think about this is the number of dollars that we need in order to buy a specific number of units would be whatever the price is in our currency divided by the exchange rate. I'm just kind of rearranging this equation here. So what we're going to do if we're given values for this is something, excuse me, that looks like the following. Okay. I can get this. There we go. So let's assume we have this demand for a product, right? We know that the current price in the US is 500 and the current exchange rate is 2.5 euros to 1 US dollar. So for every dollar we want, we'd have to give up 2.5 euros. What's the number of euros that are required to buy that good? And what would the total quantity be? So essentially, when I say how many euros to buy one, that's the price in terms of the euro of this good. So how would we solve this, right? So if I've got my quantity demanded from that foreign market or from that foreign country, looks something like this. And we know that the price in the US was 500. And then that exchange rate was 2.5 euros to every dollar. Well, if we want to find the price in terms of that foreign currency, it's the price in the US times that exchange rate, or 500 times 2.5. Okay. So if we do this math here, we get what? 1,250. If I then want to find the quantity or the number of units of this product that are going to be demanded from this foreign country, we just take our demand equation. We now know the price in terms of the foreign currency. All right, so if we do this, I believe we'll get 300. Okay. Any questions on that before I keep moving? Okay. So this is how we would solve for the quantity demanded. So the idea here is, okay, what if that exchange rate instead goes to 5 or it increases? Well, if I increase the exchange rate, I'm going to be increasing the price in terms of that foreign currency. If I increase the price of that foreign currency, I'm subtracting a larger value. I should see the quantity demanded go down. Right? So if we kind of work through this example, the price of the foreign currency at that higher exchange rate would be what? 500 times 5 or 2,500. Okay. So I'm then going to go back in. Make sure I'm getting my math correct here. Okay. Now here I'll kind of do a weird example. I'm kind of doing numbers on the fly, but I'll use it to make a point. I wouldn't give you an example that looks like this just because it makes it a little more complicated, but it gets at the concept that I want to get at here. So I now have my new price in terms of the foreign currency. So what's my new quantity demanded? 800 minus 0.4 times 2,500. I actually get here negative 200. Well, we can't demand less of a good. So what would really the demand be here? 0. On any example I give you on the quiz or exam, I'll make sure that both of these values are positive. Here, I just want to kind of really show that when that exchange rate goes up, the quantity that we see demanded can go down quite a bit. In fact, here it becomes negative, in which case we don't want to buy any more of that product. Okay. So exchange rates going down are going to decrease the quantity that we want. So if we think about what's the total quantity of US dollars that they need, well, we said that was going to be equal to sorry, there we go. So that was going to be equal to the price in terms of the foreign currency over the exchange rate times the quantity that they demand. So kind of here when our exchange rate went up, so that drove down the quantity that they want to buy, that's going to actually decrease the number of US dollars that we need. So as the exchange rate gets higher, right, or kind of worse for those domestic markets, they're going to have a decrease in the number of products they want to buy, which inherently means they don't need as many US dollars as before because they're not buying as much of the US products. So that's kind of these numerical examples that I would kind of give you examples of. And this really kind of shows us that relationship of the exchange rate and the amount of US dollars that are demanded. It really works through the fact that it's altering the number of units or the number of this product that another country wants to buy. If they're buying less, they don't need as many US dollars. Okay. Or what we'll end up saying is they're not demanding as many US dollars as before. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. So, um, we worked through this example. We kind of got all these values. Okay. So let's instead think about the supply. So that was kind of making this point of that the demand for a product is going to be going up as that price in terms of the foreign currency goes down. So we can think about the supply as well. Whoop, it's going to look like just every other market. When the price of the US dollar falls, right? Well, as kind of that price falls or that exchange rate gets, you think about it as it improves for the US, that means that the US is going to want to kind of supply more currency to these other markets. And so as that price increases, right, the US dollar actually we require more uh, more of the foreign currency to get the same number of US dollars. We're going to want to supply more currency to these foreign markets or to these foreign countries. So we've got this increasing supply, decreasing demand. What is this going to look like? We'll take a peek here in a second, but it's going to determine the exchange rate, right? Where does that exchange rate come from? It's going to be where the supply of a currency is equal to the demand of a currency. So from here on out, we're just going to focus on the US currency. Okay? I think it'll make it easier instead of bouncing back and forth. We're just going to look at the money market or just look at the market for US currency. So the exchange rate we're going to be looking at will reflect the price of a dollar in terms of a foreign currency. So the exchange rate for the US dollar would look something like the following, right? If we need 2 euros for every dollar, our exchange rate would be 2. Right? That means that what amount of the foreign currency do we need to get 1 US dollar? Well, 2 euros per dollar would be an exchange rate of 2 for the US dollar. So then kind of start to think about where does that come from? Well, there's going to be demand and supply for the US dollar, just like there was for the quantity of the foreign currency that was demanded. So we're just going to focus on that money demand or money market, all right? The relationship between exchange rates and the quantity of US dollars. We're just going to focus on the US here. So it'll be some overall demand, some overall supply. The equilibrium exchange rate is where those two are equal to each other. Just like other markets, we're looking for that point where supply is equal to demand. It's just now what's on our y-axis, exchange rates. So as the exchange rate goes down, right, this is the idea that now instead of 5 euros, it only costs 2 euros to get a dollar. Well, that means that we're going to want to buy, right? We're going to want to buy more US products. We need a higher quantity of US dollars. And so as that exchange rate for the US dollar gets worse, that's actually benefiting other countries. So they're going to demand more of US products and then kind of the byproduct of that is they need more US dollars to buy those products. And then if the exchange rate was getting better for the US, so for the US, if their dollar equates to 2 euros and all of a sudden it equates to 5 euros, well, their dollar now has more value in these other countries, so they're going to want to buy more products, right, from these other countries. Excuse me. or they're going to supply more US dollars, right, in terms of how money they're giving to these other countries to buy their products. So basic supply and demand model is what we're looking at here. It's just usually we have prices on the y-axis. The exchange rate, you can think about it as like the price of currency. So what's going to cause changes in exchange rates, or how can we think about what changes in exchange rates tell us? So if a currency appreciates, right, we're thinking about that it has more value. So relative to other currencies, if our currency appreciates, it has more value, right? We can buy more of other countries' products. So as the exchange rate decreases for other countries, right? That actually means for the US dollar, so I'll add in here, I meant for this to be exchange rate of other countries decreases. Inherently, that would mean the exchange rate for the US goes up, right? It improves, or it increases the value of that US currency. Right? So this would be the idea if the euros to US dollars goes from 3 to 4, the US dollar now will get you more euros, you have a more valuable currency, right? You're getting more of that foreign currency for the same number of US dollars. And then depreciation is the exact opposite. So this would be if our currency is worth less relative to others. Exchange rates for other countries would increase in terms of um, their their currency is now worth more US dollars, or the US dollar is worth less of theirs. So this would be like if every US dollar before was €3, now it's 2, that would be US dollar depreciation. Any questions on that? So I throw in here, it's the exchange rate for like the foreign currency increases and decreases. All right. So when we're thinking about the supply and demand of the US currency, right? If we think about exchange rates, right, for the US dollar, if they decrease, right, then that means to other countries, our products are now relatively cheaper. And so they're going to want to buy more of our products. They need more US dollars. And so the demand for the US dollar is going to increase. So if the amount of euros it takes to buy one US dollar now decreases, that actually means that for other countries, things are now relatively cheaper, right? We would kind of see that US to euro exchange rate actually have this flip exchange rate for the amount of euros it takes to buy one US dollar. Sorry, yeah, if it decreases, we're thinking about um, now in terms of how much does it take us to buy €1, it would have the kind of exact opposite effect. So if that exchange rate decreases, right, for foreign countries, it actually improves the US to euro exchange rate, right? So here, if we want to think about the number of US dollars to get €1, if that increases, then that's more costly for the US to kind of obtain a single euro. And then the European Union, our products of the US dollar has kind of, our US products are now relatively cheaper. And so they would want to supply more euros to our market. Okay. I think once we go through this, I think it'll be a little bit easier to think about. But for now, I'll kind of go through this line of thinking. And I think once we break down these models, it'll become a little bit clearer. But I want to kind of set up a summary here first. So let's say the value of the domestic currency, and here we're always the domestic country we're going to be thinking about is the US, so it's the US dollar. If the US dollar depreciates, it has less value. So if it has less value for the domestic country, the US, what that means is that when other countries are thinking about buying our product, well, now, if instead of every dollar costs 10 euros, it only costs 5, it's relatively cheaper for those countries to buy our products or to use our currency to buy those products. So what's going to happen if they want to buy more of our products or they want more of our dollars to buy those products, we're going to see an increase in demand or an increase in exports. The US is going to export more to these countries because they want more of our products. On the flip side, right? If our currency has less value, we kind of already connected this in an earlier module, but if we have less value at the very end of module 11, if our currency has less value, we're not going to buy as many of the foreign products as before, right? So we would need less foreign currency, right? We're not going to be able to buy as much, so we're going to see imports actually decrease. And we don't need, we won't want to hold as much foreign currency because we're not going to be importing as much from them. Well, if exports increase for the US, imports decrease, we're going to end up with an overall increase in net exports. And then kind of the reverse would be true if we have the opposite. So what is this going to look like? And let me make sure I'm not. Yeah, so I'm going to dive right into the next slide, but I'm going to do so in kind of building this out, and then we'll kind of go back and look at the summary. So let's say I've got kind of thinking about, we'll tie this back into our aggregate demand model. And we'll talk a little bit more about where exactly these exchange rates come from here in a second. But when we looked at our long run aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, here we go. Here's our short run aggregate supply. So let's say we start out in a scenario where long run GDP is the same as short run GDP. Okay. If the US dollar, here, okay, I first said depreciates in the slide. So if it depreciates, we can think about what does that mean? Its value is going down. Okay. So we'll tie this to exchange rates here in a little bit, but just for now, we want to think about how does the value of the dollar, which will coincide with exchange rate, how does that impact our net exports? Well, if the value of our dollar goes down, right, other countries' products, right, are going to cost us more, which means, focus this in, there we go, which means that we're going to import less. Now, if the dollar depreciates, it has less value. The foreign currency will inherently have more value, or the foreign currency is actually appreciating. So if the foreign currency appreciates, the value of their currency actually goes up, right? The US goods are now less costly to them. So they're going to buy more of them, which means the US exports, so this is like the US exports and imports, will actually go up. Well, what's kind of the total effect of this? Our net exports, or exports minus imports. So if imports go down, exports go up, net exports are going to increase. What's that going to do to the US economy? And this is where it gets a little bit counterintuitive, but remember, our aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus net exports. So if net exports increase, we get an increase in the aggregate demand for the US. What does that do in the short run? It actually causes GDP in the short run to be too high, or we've got an inflationary gap. Okay. So this is where it's a little counterintuitive that when the US dollar depreciates, it has less value. It actually ends up increasing US net exports because more of their products are being purchased through that expenditure model. We see aggregate demand go up, and we actually see that in the short run, we've got an inflationary gap. Now, this kind of makes sense with something we talked about earlier. I think I showed you some of the numbers. The US like always has a negative net export. So why? Well, if net exports are positive when the dollar depreciates or has less value, the US dollar typically has a value higher than most other countries. So if it has instead high value dollar, we would end up seeing not an inflationary gap, but a deflationary gap from from net exports going down or being negative. Okay. So I'll kind of draw that out for us here in a second, but really the ultimate kind of story here is when the US dollar depreciates or has less value, that actually increases net exports because we're buying less from other countries, they're buying more from us, and we actually see inflationary gaps being caused. Now we could work through the exact kind of opposite example. If I can keep this all in the same thing here. Maybe. So let's instead assume, there we go. So I'm thinking about real GDP here, thinking about I've got my aggregate demand, got my long run aggregate supply. got my short run aggregate supply. Initially, GDP in the long and short run are the same. And here was kind of our current price level. So if instead we see the US dollar appreciate, that means that its value is increasing, which means that we're looking at other countries. If our dollar has more value, we're going to buy more from these foreign countries or these foreign markets. So that's going to actually do what? Increase our imports. On the flip side, if the US dollar is more valuable, then the foreign currency depreciates or has less value. So if the foreign currency has less value, they can't buy as much of the US products or fewer. What's that going to do? It's going to decrease exports. And then there, if we think about what's the total effect, well, net exports is exports minus imports. Imports are going up, exports are going down, subtracting a larger value, decreasing this here. Total exports decrease, in which case, what's happening in the US economy? We're seeing an aggregate demand decrease. We're causing GDP in the short run to actually go down. It's now too low relative to the long run. What have we caused? A deflationary or a recessionary gap. Okay. So we're going to, as we kind of work through this module, connect changes in the value of the currency, which we'll kind of talk through in terms of how do we measure that with exchange rates. And then how do those changes in exchange rates and the value of the currency impact our economy's overall kind of GDP in the short run? And do we have inflation or recessionary gaps created? And then where would like new long run prices, et cetera, be? Any questions on anything there before we keep moving? So I walked through kind of the steps as to why it happens. And I have this in the slides, but just like a good summary, if you're wanting to kind of have this maybe written down in those handwritten notes. If the US dollar appreciates, we said that's going to lead to what? Net exports decreasing and recessionary gaps. Whereas if the US dollar depreciates, that led to net exports increasing and inflationary gaps. And that's just kind of a nice little summary of what we just worked through. Okay. And then I don't think we'll get there today, but next class we'll start to think about how does that also impact price levels in the US. Okay. All right. So that's what I kind of have here. We're just kind of walking through what are the impacts of the domestic currency of the US dollar's appreciation and depreciation, its relationship to exports. And then we'll focus more next class on what does that do to, we focus on GDP, the short run GDP changes, it causes recessionary or inflationary gaps. We could also think about how does it impact prices. This is really stuff we've already talked about, just to kind of allude to it, right? If I had this change, what happens to short run prices? Well, short run prices actually go up. And then where would our new long run outcome be? Well, eventually, if we don't have fiscal or monetary policy, short run aggregate supply adjusts, and we end up with, because of this depreciation, we actually end up with even higher prices in the US in the long run. So when you think about these changes in the US dollar's value will change net exports, which then change our real GDP and our long run price levels. So I kind of maybe, I don't know, didn't really go out of order here, but eventually I'm going to want to connect what we're going to talk about with exchange rates to net exports and the impacts it has on aggregate demand, aggregate supply. This is where I'm limiting the concepts we're covering, but they're all related. So eventually, once we talk more through Module 12 material, we're going to really tie this back into stuff we talked about in earlier modules. In fact, this goes back to like module 8, or sorry, module 7. So this is where the exam's not cumulative, but it's comprehensive in that we're still using that aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, just like we did in modules 9 and 11, 9, 10, and 11. Okay. So let's think instead, where does this valuation of the dollar, whether it's appreciating or depreciating, where does that come from? Okay. So here, I think I skipped ahead on accident. Where am I at here? Oh, did I skip through this? Yeah, I did. I didn't want to go quite that far. So let me think here. So we left off here. Okay, the things that are going to change our currency demand. So before we talk about the specifics, right, let's think through what's going to happen to our exchange rates. Okay. So if we're instead thinking about the quantity of the US dollar and then our equilibrium exchange rates, we said, well, that's simply going to be where the supply of the US dollar is equal to the demand for the US dollar. Where those two are the same, that's going to be our equilibrium exchange rate and the equilibrium amount of US dollars we see out there. Now, we'll talk about what would cause these shifts, but just for right now, if we saw that all of a sudden there's an increase in the demand for the US dollar. So if we saw an increase in the demand for the US dollar, what's that going to do to our equilibrium point? It's going to increase our exchange rate and increase the number of US dollars that we see out there, right? The equilibrium number. So let's think about kind of why. So think about it this way. If we have, remember this exchange rate we can think about as like 10 euros to 1 US dollar. If that increases, it now might take 20 euros to get that same US dollar, or essentially for the same number of US dollars, we're gonna, sorry, let me say it this way. At every quantity of US dollars, we're going to see that we'd be willing to demand that at even higher exchange rates than before. That would be an entire demand increase or shift. Okay. Another way to think about this as at the same exchange rate, something that causes a shift in demand means that even if the exchange rate was the same, we're going to see that the quantity of US products and then consequently the number of US dollars that are demanded or that people would need is going to be higher. So this is kind of similar to when we were thinking about other models, that when there's shifts in demand, it's at the same level of whatever's on our y-axis. We now want whatever, we want more of whatever's on our x-axis. So here, even at the same exchange rate, whatever shifts demand for US dollars, we now see that at that same exchange rate, more US dollars are going to be demanded. So we can think about shifts in demand will cause changes to our equilibrium. This is going to look like any other supply demand model we have. We could also do supply shifts, right? So I'll come back to supply shifts if we have time at the end of class, but I want to focus on now what is causing these shifts in demand. Okay. So we'll go through a couple of these. And before we do, if exchange rates go up, what is that actually telling us, right? So if I go from every US dollar was previously worth 10 euros to 20, my exchange rate's going up. That means every US dollar can get me more of the foreign currency, or the US dollar has more value or is appreciating, right? So we can kind of think about appreciation means the US dollar has more value. And that kind of makes sense. If there's a demand increase for the US dollar, it's going to be, more desired, the valuation of it's going to increase. And then the reverse would be true if we had a demand decrease, right? Well, there we're thinking about that would lower exchange rates. So now if instead of 10 euros, I can only get 5, my US dollar has less value or it's depreciating. Okay. questions. So what's going to cause these shifts, right? So the first thing that we'll kind of think about is what if interest rates, and these are all going to be specific to the US. So we'll really focus on just what's going to cause changes in the demand for US currency today. At the very end of class, in the in-class quiz, I've got the next topic that we'll talk about, which is what causes supply shifts. But for now, we're just going to focus on demand shifts. So if interest rates in the US are higher, typically when we're looking at other markets, specifically thinking about real GDP and prices, interest rates were a bad thing because it made borrowing more or less costly to the US companies. Now, if we're thinking about demand for the US dollar, here the relationship actually works in the opposite direction because if interest rates are higher, right, that means that when other countries make investments into our financial products or into products that are in terms of the US dollar, well, if interest rates are higher, that means my investment is going to pay off a higher amount. So real interest rates are actually going to be a good thing when I'm thinking about making investments into products that require the US dollar. So higher interest rates will actually mean in the US will lead to higher demand for the US dollar. Okay? Because there now we're making investments in these US projects, they're going to pay off more. Right? They're going to have a higher payoff. So anytime we talk about these things, a demand increase for the US currency, well, now relative to other currencies, their currency has like less value, or in terms of the interest rates, investments into foreign projects now have lower payoffs. Right? So higher US real interest rates increase the demand for the US dollar, decrease the demand for other currencies. What if instead we have a more stable economy? So let's say we aren't involved in any wars, right? And we don't have a lot of volatility in the valuation of our currency. Well, essentially, interest rates are telling us the payoff for an investment. Economic stability is going to tell us there's lower risk, right? Or it's a safer investment. So what typically happens when you have safer investments, all other things being equal, like even if the payoff was the same, right? We're just zeroing in on the stability. Well, if the payoff is the same, but it's a more stable investment, I want to invest more into it. Right? So that's kind of where that relationship comes from. What if the US productivity increases? Right? Well, if US productivity increases, excuse me, we can expect like the same, um, sorry, excuse me. Um, if the productivity in the US increases, we're going to see an overall increase in the valuation of that dollar, or essentially, to get the same number of products, when productivity increases, that lowers costs, which will inherently lower prices, input costs will lower prices. So if prices in the US are lower, well, the same number of US dollars will get me more units of whatever product I'm buying. So am I more or less likely to want to have a US dollar? More likely, demand increases. So productivity is directly related to prices. So if I think that having lower prices, right, makes the dollar worth more and increases demand, higher prices or inflation means that the same US dollar gets me fewer products. I'm not going to be as likely to want to hold those US dollars, or we see a decrease in the demand for currency. So what would cause an increase in currency demand? Not higher prices in the US, but lower prices or deflation. And then kind of our two other categories, which aren't really any new concepts, but basically any of these changes, but expectations would have the same impact. So if people think that real interest rates are going to be higher tomorrow, they'll act today as though they are. Or if I think that the US is going to become more stable over time, I'll invest into things today like they already are. Right? So that kind of expectations, all the shifts would be the exact same. Whether I have higher prices or expect them, it would cause that decrease in the demand. And then we kind of have a catch-all category. So there's probably other things that we could kind of group in here, but to not have like a list of 20 things, we kind of throw a catch-all category, which is something else that changes that would increase the preferences for foreign governments, consumers, or businesses to want to hold US dollars. Okay. Or vice versa, right? Maybe there's an increased preference for foreign assets. So we won't really use this catch-all category a lot, but I'm just kind of throwing it out there. Maybe in some of the questions to make it easier, instead of giving you a specific thing, and then knowing what impact it would have on demand, I just tell you that there's a higher preference for the US dollar. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Oh, so I've got this kind of drawn out here. I already kind of showed you that increases in demand will increase our equilibrium exchange rates. Um, but we can kind of think about some other things as well. So let's say, oh, we can do interest rates here. And then I think next class we'll kind of focus more on some of the other shifts and then changes in current supply. So for today, we've talked through these things that would shift demand. So let's think about maybe one example. So this is what a kind of question would look like. And we'll work through one in the daily quiz here in just a second, but I want to zero in on just one of these first. So if we're thinking about real GDP and prices, I'm going to kind of connect the dots because I think we have enough time here. So you guys always kind of benefit. They usually go through things a little bit more effectively and efficiently, I think, in this second section. Oops, just because I've already done it first. So this is like the quantity of the US dollar. Here is our exchange rate. So I've got some supply of the US dollar. I've got some demand for the US dollar. We start out, here's the equilibrium exchange rate. Here's the equilibrium number of US dollars. If I saw, we'll kind of use the example I think that I had in the slides, which was if the real interest rate in the US, let me make sure it coincides here. I think I did increases, right? No, decreases, right? So if the real interest rate in the US decreases, what impact is that going to have on the money market for the US dollar? Well, if interest rates are lower, investments that require the US dollar are actually, the payoff is going to go down. So at the same exchange rate, if these projects pay off less, have a lower payoff, at every single exchange rate, I'm going to be willing to demand, or I want less of that US dollar than before. So there we would see a demand decrease when real interest rates in the US are lower, right? Those projects are kind of paying off a lower amount. So what impacts would that have on our exchange rate? It would decrease it. So this would be the idea like before, it took 10 euros to get one US dollar. Now it only takes 5. So what does that do to the US currency? Well, the US currency now has less value, or we would say it has depreciated. So what did we say? What impact does that have? And here, if it's easier, I don't know. For me, it's always easier to think about this as because the exchange rate tells us something about the value of the US currency. I always think about it as like when the US dollar has less value, I'm going to import less, right? And then if I'm importing less, what happens to net exports? Well, if this goes down, I'm subtracting a smaller value, net exports would increase. So if I want to then think about the impacts that this is going to have, this net export change on my US economy, well, if GDP, we started out with no gap, right? Short and long run GDP are the same. Here's our price levels in the US. If net exports increase because of this exchange rate decrease, so you almost think about it here. Real interest rates changes the exchange rate, changes net exports. What does the increase in net exports do? Shifts our aggregate demand, or increases it, shifts it to the right, increasing our short run GDP, which now causes an inflationary gap. Okay. So I'll kind of foreshadow a little bit, but who can influence interest rates in the US? The Fed. If the Fed changes interest rates, that then has impacts on our US dollar money market, which then impacts net exports, which then impacts kind of short run GDP. Okay. So one of the ways in which the monetary policy of the Fed can impact whether or not we have inflation or recessionary gaps, we kind of connected this idea at the very end of module 11, which is that it influences net exports, We just didn't specifically say how. It's doing so through exchange rates. And those exchange rates tell us something about whether the US currency is appreciating or depreciating. Okay. So we alluded to this idea at the end of the last module. Here's really where it comes from, kind of connecting these two markets, right? The economy, kind of wide market, relationship between price and real GDP, and then that market where we're seeing, well, what's causing that aggregate demand shift? It's changes in the exchange rate. Any questions on this before we jump into the daily quiz here? Okay. So take a look here. We'll kind of go back a little bit to the beginning of class in this first question, and then we'll work through the second question and kind of review a little bit more of what we're going to talk about tomorrow. Oh, did I call this the wrong thing? No, 27. Hold on. Why did I just imagine that it said 29? Okay, I did say 27. I don't know why I thought it said 29 for a second. Just making sure that, oh, the due date's the 29. So that's okay. So let's think about this one and we'll kind of walk through these. So here I'm giving you a demand equation for the foreign country. I tell you the price of the US dollar, the exchange rate, what's the quantity demanded of the foreign product. And I'll maybe add a question here that could be a little bit more complicated. But if I think about here, I've got my demand equation from that foreign country. I know the price in the US of this product is 500 and the exchange rate is 5, right? So it takes 5 of the foreign currency to get every 1 US dollar. So we said, what's the price in terms of the foreign currency? It's however much this good costs in the US times however much of my currency I would need to get 1 of those US dollars. So here we've got what? 500 times 5 is 2,500. Right? And then, well, what's the quantity that would be demanded? 40,000 minus 0.5 times that price we just determined. Right? So I think if we just kind of get this entered into our calculator, it'll be 33,750. Right? So here I want to think about two different things or two different questions. So if this is the amount of the good we want to buy from the US, what's the total quantity demanded of the US dollar? Well, if this is the number of units we want to buy, what's the total number of dollars that we need? That number of units times how much was each unit costing us in the US? 500. So this would be kind of the total value of US dollars that we would need. Okay. So it'd be half that was like, oh, I don't know, 15,000 and then what, roughly 875. I'm not sure if I'm doing the math in my head correct there, but we could get this into our calculator and figure out what's the total number of not units that we want, but what's the total number of US dollars we need to buy those units. Okay. Now, an additional question we could think about is, what if the exchange rate goes up? What's going to be true about the total number of US dollars that are demanded? Well, if the exchange rate goes up, right, we now need more of that foreign currency. The price in terms of the foreign currency would go up. If we're subtracting a higher value here, the quantity we want goes down, which means the number of US dollars demanded is also going to go down. When countries want fewer of our products, they don't need as many dollars as before. So when that exchange rate improves, it makes the other currency less valuable, right? So here that would make exchange rates go up. The US currency is worth more, but the foreign currency, the value goes down, right? So they're going to export less, or the quantity from that foreign country goes down, which inherently that's part of the quantity for US dollars. So the quantity for US dollars demanded goes down. That's kind of exactly where we had that downward sloping demand curve for US currency. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. So the second question, I'll be kind, also for the sake of time. I'll kind of show you what the answers are, and then we're going to work through each one of these. Oh, did I not have it? Oh, I have to exit the preview because I didn't see anything. There we go. So it'll be lower expected inflation and decrease real interest rates in the foreign country is what's going to cause our equilibrium exchange rates to go up. We'll kind of walk through these. So based off what we talked about today, we only thought about things that were shifting the demand curve. So that was going to be changes to things that were in the US. So we said interest rates, prices, etc. So let's think through the ones that are specific to the US. If the US becomes less stable, lower expected inflation in the US, and then decreases in the US exchange rate. So let's determine why each one of these, two of them weren't correct, one of them was. And then we'll talk about changes in the foreign market once we're done there. Okay. So when we're thinking about how do we determine what these equilibrium exchange rates are, we've got our exchange rate. That equilibrium exchange rate comes from the supply of US dollars and the demand for US dollars. So initially we started out, here was our exchange rate. And we'll just focus on that. We could do the quantity as well. But, okay. So the first option was, what if the US economy becomes less stable? So if it's less stable, even at the same exchange rate, it's a riskier investment. If it's a riskier investment, am I going to be more or less likely to want to make it? Less likely. So this is going to cause, from other countries, the demand for US products or the demand for the US dollar to go down. If that's the case, what happens to our equilibrium exchange rate? It actually goes down. We're looking for what's going to increase it. So that one wasn't a correct answer. Now, what if instead we expect lower inflation in the US? And this one, to be clear, this was that the US was less stable. Well, if we think there's going to be lower inflation, that means prices, relatively speaking, are going to be lower, right? They're not increasing as much, right? There's lower inflation. So if we think there's going to be lower inflation in the future, or if there was lower inflation today, that means that the same number of dollars in my pocket is going to be able to buy more products. So even if the exchange rate was the same, with lower relative prices, I'm now going to want to buy more products. I need more US dollars to do that. So I'd see this increase in demand. What does that do? Increases my exchange rate, which is that's why that was one of the correct answers, right? Lower expected inflation would actually cause exchange rate increases. Now, the third option we had for the US was, what if their exchange rate increases? Well, this is where we have to be careful. And this is like if you took B251, you looked at this in terms of goods. We've talked about this in other markets that we've looked at. But changes in whatever is on your y-axis doesn't change your equilibrium value. All it does is move you to different points on the supply and demand curve. So it doesn't change what equilibrium you're at. It just changes what point you're on the supply and demand curve. So it won't cause changes in the equilibrium exchange rate. It's just going to cause differences in where you're at in the supply demand curve. We won't dive into this, but just to kind of give, I don't know, those of you who are interested or can connect this to things you've already thought about or already seen from other markets. So if this is the equilibrium point, and let's say the current exchange rate is not at that equilibrium, well, that would mean the quantity demanded is here, the quantity supplied is here. We've got like surpluses and shortages in terms of the US dollar. We won't dive into that, like surplus and shortages here, but if you've seen that from like, I can't remember, I teach 251, I think it's module 6 maybe. But we would kind of think about, we could find shortages and surplus in the US dollar market as well. So changes in that exchange rate don't change what that equilibrium will be in the long run. It just changes, well, whether or not in the short run we have surpluses or shortages. Any questions on that before I go through the other two answers, which we didn't really quite talk about today, but I'll go through them and introduce the idea that we'll focus more on next class. Okay. So what I described earlier about things that shift the demand for currency were changes to things in the US, right? So if we're thinking about changes to US factors, will shift the demand for US dollars. Okay. So if instead we think about equilibrium interest rates, what if there's changes not to the US, but the change to foreign markets? Right? This is actually going to cause shifts in the supply of US dollars. So let's think about why. So the first one, we'll think about, let's say the foreign country becomes more unstable, right? Well, that means if they're more unstable, what am I going to want to do? Actually, sorry, what did I say in the quiz? Uh, oh, I'll do a different one. Just to line up with the quiz. So what I said, there was an increase in their productivity. So if the foreign country has an increase in their productivity, what's going to be true, right? Well, there at the same exchange rate, we said productivity increases. And really, where did this come from? Productivity increases do what? They shift long run aggregate supply, driving prices down. If prices in foreign markets are lower, are we going to want more or less, invest more or less into them? We're going to want more, right? So if we want to invest more into those countries, we need more we need more of the foreign currency demand. We need less, right? Sorry, let me stop myself. So lower prices in other countries means that we're going to want to make more investments into those countries. So we're going to take our US dollars, start to put more of them into the foreign market. So it increases in the productivity of other countries, lowers their prices. We're actually going to see an increase in the supply of US dollars to those countries. So what is that going to do? It's going to cause interest. I put interest rates here. Sorry, I'm running without thinking about what I'm doing. We're talking about exchange rates, right? So that's going to lower my exchange rate for the US dollar. So increases in foreign countries' productivity actually decrease the US equilibrium exchange rate. Right? Now, what if instead the other option that ended up being true was what if I have a decrease in the interest rate, real interest rate of foreign countries? Well, if the interest rate is lower, that means investments into those foreign countries' currency, or you can think about it as investments in that foreign countries like financial products, they're going to have a lower payoff or return. So if there's a lower payoff or return, even if the exchange rate is the same, am I going to want to invest more or less into that country? Right? I'm going to want less, so I'm going to supply fewer US dollars to them. So if I have fewer US dollars supplied, what's that going to do? Well, that's actually going to increase those equilibrium exchange rates for the US. So that's why the decrease in real interest rates of the foreign country actually lead to increases in the exchange rate for the US dollar. Now, once again, let's be careful here because prices are generally, we think about them as a bad thing, right? When it's my currency, a higher exchange rate actually means what? Well, that means that the same US dollar is getting more of that foreign currency. So this would cause higher exchange rates, which actually means the value of the dollar is increasing, right? Or we're having appreciation of the US dollar. So what we'll kind of focus on next class is we have these things that shift demand. Those are changes to things in the US, changes in US interest rates, US price levels, US productivity. Those will shift the demand for the US dollar. Changes in other markets will mean that we want more or less of the foreign currency, which inherently means if we want more of that currency, we're going to have to take more of our US dollars to get that. So that's going to cause like supply and demand increases or decreases in terms of the US dollar. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving here? So we'll start to kind of probably start with supply shifts next class. We're then going to start to tie in all these things, right? So we'll do some simultaneous changes in supply and demand. That's going to look similar to what we did with simultaneous changes in other markets. We're then going to pretty quickly translate this to, well, if I have changes in the exchange rate, we said we know that's going to change valuation of the dollar, which changes net exports, which changes real GDP or price levels, which then how can we counteract those effects of inflation or deflationary gaps? We can use monetary or fiscal policy. But notice the reverse would be true as well. If we have monetary policy that's influencing exchange rates, that's going to influence the demand or supply of a currency, which then would impact the exchange rate of that currency. So we can kind of see how initial impacts in monetary or fiscal policy impact exchange rates, but then also impacts in exchange rates. How would those impact overall price levels and GDP in the US economy? So really tomorrow, we're going to primarily start to throw all of these models together. So we're going to kind of revisit some concepts from module 11 and 12. We'll finish up a lot of these concepts from from modules 9 and 11. We'll finish up material concepts from module 12. And then once again, I think we'll get through everything tomorrow. If not, I'll probably start off Wednesday with some of these more complicated, like combining all these modules into one. And then if you have any questions over any of the practice problems, old quiz questions, it'd be good to start kind of reviewing. I think I might have failed to mention this at the beginning of class. So before we end here, I'll make sure I do that. Um, that fifth quiz, that's due by the end of the day today. So after today, you'll be able to review the answers to that fifth quiz. So that would be a good thing to start studying. Once again, it's over modules 9, 10, and 11. We're going to start to kind of add those into module 12. So having a good understanding of those concepts are really going to be beneficial for tomorrow's class and then that beginning of Wednesday's class. Okay. So I'm going to end the recording there.